They have a more recent common ancestor.
Yeah. But if that's due to homoplasy, there's not.
True, but homoplasy is much less likely than
sir,
them having a common ancestor.
But for you
and you can say that based on evidence and reason. That's a good reason to say that.
But for you to say homoplasy is much more less likely, you have to give now evidence.
ما خاب من يبغي دوم الرضا مولاه ما خاب من يبغي دوم الرضا مولاه.
Test happens, you're there, he's there, we want to find out who the father is.
Yes.
Human. Yeah. Where's the assumption of common ancestry?
Well, like, more important than like observing that we're all humans is that you observe how similar are the genetic sequences are.
Okay, so would you do a paternity test between you two and a dog?
What you could feasibly do is you could take two humans, get their DNA, compare it to a dog, and then look and kind of ask which human being kind of diverted from a dog earlier. You could do that.
Right. So that particular.
Or which human being probably.
So is that actually an example of a paternity test?
It would be a modified paternity test.
A paternity test is who is the parent.
Sure, but that's what you use it for. But you could use the same.
No, but sir, what's happening here is this. I think you understand. I think you're understanding the problem here. When it comes to a paternity test, parent human, child human, Homo sapien, Homo sapien, Homo sapien. We already know they are all part of Homo sapiens. Now we try and find out how they're genetically related.
Okay, but you're
trying
to find out who the father is.
When it comes to human chimpanzee ancestry, or one strip of DNA and another strip of DNA, we know examples of where DNA is very, very similar, but it's not due to common ancestry.
But we know that that's
that's not.
We know that that's less likely.
Wait, hang on a second. That is homology. When you go out with the assumption that these two species are related because of so-and-so DNA, genetics, morphology, whatever. Paternity test, we know they're all Homo sapien. So that's a false analogy.
Okay, let's
Do you get it? If you don't, we go over again.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but let's go over it a little bit more.
Sure.
So why does a paternity test tell you whether one human is the father or another human is the father? What do you look at?
Similarity.
Okay, yes. And so what's the reason?
We're not looking at common ancestry here.
Yeah. What's the reason why one man having a genome that's more similar to the child in question provides evidence that that man is the father?
Okay, let me give you a counterfactual to tease it out.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Can a paternity test show that the child being tested is a completely different species?
Can a paternity test show that the child being tested is a completely different species? That would generally, that's not a question being asked.
Yes, exactly.
The only question being asked is how similar is the gene.
Exactly. That's the point. Another counterfactual. Leave the paternity test aside.
Can you answer my question?
I'm about to. Can two different parents of whatever species having a common ancestor, can it be shown logically, yes or no, that both things are possible, that they have a recent common ancestor?
So can you repeat that?
So let me break it down a bit more. Paternity test, we already know human.
Yeah, we know that.
And now we're just trying to see who's more closely related.
Yes.
Homology of human chimpanzee tree or human pig or the tree of life, we don't already know that they're related.
Yeah.
We're assuming that they're related because of this, and then we go out and try and verify it.
No, I disagree.
Okay, go on, tell me why it's different. Because or else it's circular reasoning.
Okay, so...
Do you get it though?
Yeah, I get it. So, the first observation we make is how DNA behaves in organisms when they reproduce.
Yep.
And how, the genes mutate over time randomly, and there's crossover, and so we observe how that happens, and that it happens at an average rate. Okay, and since we observe that it's happening now, we extrapolate that it will have also happened in previous generations of organisms, because that's the model which best fits the evidence at hand. And so, given that we believe we kind of infer that kind of this gradual mutation has happened, like going back in the generations, we assume that the on average, the more different two genomes are, the further back they will have diverged. Yep. And so obviously there are certain things that can make the rates change more or less quickly, like the founder effect and the presence of mutagens, but still kind of like other things being equal, kind of that's one of the principles involved in when you kind of do this kind of these phylogenetic trees, and when you try and like test whether kind of how closely related, I'll try and find out how close which two organisms are more closely related. But and you use the same reasoning with a paternity test, because in the paternity test you look at three people's DNA and you say hang on.
I'm just going to stop you there. You look at three people's DNA.
Yes.
So you already know they're part of the same species.
True.
Which is why you cannot compare paternity test to homology.
No, but you need to like. But I already explained the principle though. The principle isn't.
No, but what you're doing is this. I'm pointing out a disanalogy. Do you see the difference between the two?
It's not a relevant disanalogy.
Okay, so there is a disanalogy, but you're saying it's not a relevant disanalogy. Okay, but we're getting somewhere now.
It's a difference.
So why isn't it a relevant disanalogy?
It's not relevant because, like, the DNA, like both species have DNA, and the DNA behaves similarly, kind of in both the species. It's not as if kind of I don't know, like in chimps, kind of the sort of self-repairing genes aren't active, like the ones that, like, during mitosis they check for errors. Like, you still have those error-checking enzymes, so you can still apply kind of many of the same kind of assumptions about the rate of mutation, the average rate of mutation, generation on generation. So, like, it's not particular to human beings. It's particular to all kind of sexually reproducing mammals. So you can adjust the kind of assumptions to make it to then include asexually or like multiple sexually reproducing organisms. But then it becomes like more speculative, and you have a wider confidence interval. You've got more variance in your
why don't we do this to ease it out? Say there's a paternity test.
Yeah.
What are the potential results? He is the father, or he is the father, or they're both not the father?
Well, in fact, you get a confidence interval in a paternity test.
Okay.
So because, like, if you do a paternity test on a niece, you get unsure results. So you can get uncertain results.
Okay. So either we're not sure, or he is the father, or he's not the father, or whatever.
Your degree of belief is on a continuum.
Fine. But when you try to use that as an analogy for human chimps, you have another variable which is about different species.
No, but we can observe how the genetics of those species behave.
This is actually a false analogy.
No, but that assumption is justified because you can observe how the rate of mutation of chimps generation on generation. You can observe whether they have the same enzymes repairing certain mutations.
You mean between chimps or between chimps and humans?
I'll repeat from the top. Like, you can observe whether chimps have the same rate of average rate of what's the word?
mutation,
generation on generation.
Yep.
And you can observe whether they have the same kind of cellular machinery to try and repair certain mutations. And so you can test whether, and then your model can take that into account. And so you can do an adapted paternity test using the same basic principle, which is that the more kind of different the two genomes are, the less the less recent they had a common ancestor.
But again, look, the analogy that you're using here about the paternity test, it has another dimension, which is about we don't actually know whether they are from the same species or whether they're from different species. With this, we all know that they're human. So it's just a complete disanalogy, no matter how you try and re-engineer it.
What's the relevance that stops it from? I mean, what is?
What's the relevance? The relevance is this. The relevance is this. The relevance is when it comes to a paternity test, we're not trying to determine if they're Homo sapiens.
You could do.
We're not, though. You know we're not. Which paternity test in the world?
We don't need to, but you
because we already know.
No, but you could easily, like.
Okay, hang on. The paternity test happens between three humans.
Yes.
Human.
Yeah.
We're not trying to work out a species here. Human chimpanzee ancestry, or, and this is very important, the kangaroo and the placental saber-tooth tiger, it's not the same thing.
Okay. No, but
do you get it?
No, but what you're like. So here's what solves it.
In fact, the results can be different too, because the results here are not related, closely related, or completely different species. Here, you won't get those results.
No. So what a paternity test measures is how close, how similar the genomes are.
Of the same species.
No, but then.
Of the same species.
Well, that's what we use it for, but we don't need to use it for that.
Of course you do. What are you going to do, test the dog and see if it's the son of a human? Of course you're not going to.
No, but you can test whether kind of one human has a more recent common ancestor to that dog than another human. You can do that.
But hang on.
You just need to modify it.
Hang on. That's not paternity, and you know that. A human being is not going to be a parent of a dog.
Yeah, obviously it's not going to be a parent of a dog.
And a human being, you have to remember going back. If anything, from an evolutionary perspective, it'll be like cousins of some sort.
Sure, but a paternity test.
Or maybe the dog is going to be our nephew. I don't know.
No, but a paternity test doesn't actually directly measure paternity. It directly measures how similar two genomes are.
Okay, so
and then you infer from that which one is more likely to be the human.
Okay, so
and so that's perfectly analogous.
So let me do this.
You look at which has the more similar common ancestor.
Can you do a paternity test for me, right? I'm going to give you 3 different genomes. I'm not going to tell you what species they are. Genome 1, genome 2, and genome 3.
Yes.
You've seen that these 2 genomes, genome B and genome C, are near identical.
Yes.
You're going to infer
that they have a more recent common ancestor.
Yeah. But if that's due to homoplasy, there's not.
True, but homoplasy is much less likely than
them
having a common ancestor.
But for you
and you can say that based on evidence and reason. That's a good reason to say that.
But for you to say homoplasy is much more less likely, you have to give now evidence.
Yeah, and there is evidence for why homoplasy is less likely.
Go on.
And that's because kind of when you mutate, kind of one base pair turns into another base pair in general. That's one of the kind of most.
By the way, when you show homoplasy is less likely, don't do it in the frame of common ancestry, because that would be circular reasoning.
No. All you need to know in order to know that homoplasy is less like random homoplasy is less likely.
I've never heard random homoplasy.
Let's stop using the term. Let's be more clear. So all you need to do in order to conclude that 2 organisms having a very similar genome by pure chance, even though they aren't close, even though they don't have a close common ancestor, all you need to do to work out that outcome is much less likely than the outcome of 2 organisms having the same a similar genome, being because they have a more recent common ancestor.
There's assumptions on both sides. There's the assumption of homology.
Is look at the properties of genomes, of genes and DNA and how it mutates.
But sir, here's the thing.
That's the only properties you use.
Let's tease this out practically.
Yeah.
You don't know anything about any other biological life. You have 3 genomes in front of you. A, B, C. B and C are near identical.
Yes.
You infer common ancestry. Yes. Can you be totally wrong?
Yes, but it's unlikely. It's less likely.
But for you to say it's less likely, we now have to make a separate argument for that.
Yeah,
the point is this, even from a naturalistic perspective, if you assume naturalism, and we don't assume any form of supernaturalism, even from that perspective, the same ecological niche can give rise to the same functions and genetics.
Okay, but that's not the reasoning I was going for.
I know you weren't.
Yeah. Oh well. So like the reason.
Well,
why
the reason why I'm pointing it out is to show you that you could be completely wrong about that.
Sorry, I feel like I've just kind of missed what you were saying. I'm sorry.
A, B, C.
Yes.
B and C are near identical.
Yes.
You infer common ancestry.
Yes.
Based on 99% certainty.
Yeah.
But you could be totally wrong.
Yeah, I could be totally wrong, but it'll be yeah. But I have good reason to believe that the outcome of me being wrong is less likely than the outcome that it's just like happened by chance.
Okay,
and I am wrong.
okay. So explain that to me in a non-circular way.
Okay, so
explain why homoplasy is very unlikely in a non-circular way without assuming homology.
Sure. So what we observe is that kind of all kind of organisms, or in particular mammals, since we're most interested in the human chimp example, all mammals have DNA, and the DNA in these mammals kind of behaves in particular ways, and it behaves pretty similarly in all mammals, and so it has a kind of it has rates of mutation that are comparable across different mammalian species, and so there are many different ways that a group of species that a population could so a population has an allele distribution, okay, like a distribution of like all their genomes, basically all the genomes of that population. There are many ways that could develop over time or change over time, okay. The space of different possible kind of the space of those possibilities is very big, and so the chance of you happening to converge to another one, to another kind of population, another kind of species that you aren't closely related to is much less likely.
Yeah, but you haven't explained why homoplasy is less likely outside of the framework of homology.
No, but
you've done it within the framework of homology. Do you get my point?
No, haven't I only done it within the framework of observing how
but your observation assumes homology.
No, I feel my observations are only assuming how DNA behaves, or rather, we've observed how DNA has behaved, and then we're kind of we're like looking at which model fits the evidence.
Because
best.
if you try to show homoplasy is less likely, assuming homology, all you've done is circular reasoning.
No, I haven't. All I've assumed is, well, not assumed. All that you've done is like looked at how DNA behaves and how genetics works.
Yes.
Yeah. And
how far does that take you?
And once you know that, kind of, you do know that, like, just statistically and probabilistically, the chance of two kind of species, that weren't closely related, that don't have a recent common ancestor.
But how do you know they don't have a common recent ancestor?
Because we're asking the example. Could this happen, and how likely is it? So in order for us to calculate that, or do a thumbnail calculation of that, we have to assume it.
That's the point. So the point is...
but now you're asking me how...
No, James, the point is this. No matter which way you cut the onion, it is at best, human chimp ancestry or anything in the tree of life, an assumption which has a counterfactual which can come up, which is homoplasy. At best, that's all we have.
Okay, but we know that homoplasy is much less likely than.
No, but again, that's gonna be circular reasoning if you try and justify that.
It won't be. And the person you mentioned earlier, Elliot Subboor, he'd have a very good explanation for why that's the case, and it would be based on and there'd be various ways you can look at it from frequentism.
All I'm saying is, and this is what I'm trying to make clear, I'm not saying anything different to Elliot Subboor. Elliot Subboor believes human chimp ancestry is true literally. But he says, science has only taken us this far. Human chimp ancestry is an assumption of homology. And the assumption of homology, we know of another thing called homoplasy which challenges that. Okay. And what he goes on to say, which is what I'm trying to push out to the public, to say human chimp ancestry is true literally, according to science, is naive.
Okay, but wouldn't he also say that it is the conclusion best supported by the evidence?
If you believe...
I think he would say that.
Hang on. If you believe and you come from a worldview of naturalism, yes.
Well, okay.
Meaning there's something beyond the science.
No, I think he'd probably come from the perspective of let's not assume let's be agnostic as to whether there's a
Elias
divine
Sober,
being.
Michael Ruse, all these philosophers of science and philosophers of biology, they agree. Philosophical naturalism is not the same as methodological.
Sure.
But if philosophical naturalism was true, then something like the Darwinian history of life would have to be true as a matter of logic.
Yeah, okay, sure. But
so therefore, if someone happens to be a philosophical naturalist and they're doing methodological naturalism, they conflate the two because one is science and one is the worldview that they hold.
Okay, but
do you see the problem here?
No, okay, can you repeat that? Where's the problem?
The problem is, if you hold a view in science, if you hold a view in your personal belief, a faith, which is what they call naturalism, philosophical naturalism, and you're doing methodological naturalism, assuming there's no God, no soul, no nothing, no mind, the brain at work, then because of this, you are likely to conflate the two.
Like psychologically, you might conflate the two.
Of course you would.
Quite likely.
Of course you would.
Okay, that's a potential pitfall.
And how much of a problem is that for someone who doesn't subscribe to philosophical naturalism? A big problem.
It probably wouldn't be it probably wouldn't be a problem because, like, in his book, which I've just started reading, which is basically about this question of, is there better evidence and is the quality of the evidence better for?
What book?
It's I've only just started reading. I can't quite remember the title, but basically he goes through kind of in a very rigorous, like, first principles way, kind of. Is the most sound, rational conclusion of the evidence that humans and chimps share a common ancestor, or creationist narrative?
Sure, you're talking about the book Evidence in Evolution, which is published by Cambridge University. It's got like the sand dunes on the cover, right? Yeah. Now, in that book, if you go to the chapter where it speaks about instrumentalism and scientific realism, and you go into the different discussions about that, he's very nuanced, and the view that I hold and the view which I want to educate everyone on is actually his view, which is you could be somebody who believes in God, who doesn't take it to be literally true, human chimp ancestry, take it as a probabilistic framework with assumptions, with disputes, and the other side, if they happen to be philosophical naturalists alongside methodological naturalists, and they want to accept it, as long as you are clear that you accepting this is not just purely due to science, but you have to make a leap of faith beyond that, I have no problem. Okay. So I'm not really saying anything different to what he's saying.
Okay.
And in fact, that book is one of the inspirations for me doing a lot of the sort of things that I'm doing now, because his view is, although he's an atheist and although he's not Muslim or anything, I appreciate that he's being very honest about the evidence and the nature of the evidence, and that's why I want to.
He also says that the evidence is firmly in favour of the human. He also says that the evidence is, available evidence is firmly in favour of humans and chimps having
under certain assumptions.
Okay,
there's no place in that book where he unequivocally says human chimp ancestry is supported by the evidence. Full stop.
He says
that
almost word for word in the introduction.
You'd have to read the whole thing, because in the end, where he speaks about human chimp ancestry, he says to say it's true literally is naive. At best, is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions.
Okay, but like that's the same with all science, though.
Sorry?
That's the same with all science. That it's based
exactly.
Exactly. Okay, but let's adopt the same standard that we apply for, like, medicine or that sort of thing.
Do you believe that scientific anti-realism or instrumentalism is a valid view in the philosophy of science?
I don't know what that means.
Okay. Do you believe in scientific realism?
I don't know what that means.
Okay, so you haven't read the book, because that's what the book speaks about. You have two things here. Scientific realism or scientific anti-realism, also known as instrumentalism. Now, if somebody is a scientific realist, then yes, they would say what science says is true. Now, what makes more sense is scientific instrumentalism, which is what I hold, which is what a lot of philosophers hold, and which is what I think is a rational view to hold. Now, if you hold the view of scientific realism, of course, somebody's going to say, yes, it's true literally. If you hold the view of scientific instrumentalism, you'll say it's an instrument and it's something that we use to try and arrive at new knowledge, but that's all it is.
Doesn't it show you?
So fundamentally,
doesn't it show you what
fundamentally,
what's most likely and most well supported by the evidence?
Clearly not, because this is a philosophical discussion, not a scientific discussion. One thing which is clear: genetics, anatomy, biochemistry, it is underdetermined. Scientific realism or instrumentalism is underdetermined by genetics. You cannot prove this one or that one by looking at the science itself. It's a philosophical principle for which you have to go back to first principles, which is outside of science.
Okay, how does this relate to what you told the Muslim questioner who asked you a question about humans and chimps? It sounded like what you told him was accept evolution as a working model, don't try and be like an American creationist. And then it sounded like you said, but, you know, believe in that the Quran's the perfect word of God at the same time.
Sure. What I basically said to him is this. I said to him, accept Darwinian evolution for what it is scientifically, not in a popular perspective. From a popular perspective, it's true literally. So I said, don't accept it as that. Accept it as something based on a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, which has disputes.
Okay.
Accept it
as the best supported.
Accept it as accept it as valid science. Full stop. Now, the Quran can go against valid science. It doesn't mean the Quran's wrong, because valid science over time can change. And I gave him the example of the eternal universe, the static state theory. The static state theory conflicted with the Quran 70, 80 years ago. Today the Big Bang correlates with the Quran apparently, but in the future the Big Bang may be replaced by another eternal universe.
Isn't it rational to believe in, or to have a higher degree of belief in what is more supported by evidence than
wait, hang on. When you say evidence, you have to be clear what you mean. If you come from a scientific realism point of view, then for you the evidence is going to be science. But if you come from instrumentalism, you're going to take other sources of knowledge like testimony and deductive logic and other introspection as other sources of knowledge too. So fundamentally this discussion is about first principles, which is not to do with science.
Okay, I'm open to I don't know how introspection could be I'm not sure about introspection as a source.
Introspection is not science.
But I know testimony or historical evidence. Yeah, that could be evidence, sure.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, but
even mathematics is not science.
Yeah,
logic is not science. Logic is based on mathematics and logic.
Yes.
Also values, like right and wrong, scientifically.
High degree of faith. You know, so if you have a.
So now we're not talking about science anymore. Just keep that in mind.
Okay. Yeah, because
we're talking about first principles, and we're talking about that first principle dictating the way that you look at the world. Because if you start off as an atheist, and that's your first principle, something like Darwinian evolution has to be true as a matter of logic. But if you start off as a theist, you're not going to come to that same conclusion. So fundamentally, all of this discussion boils down to first principles, which boils down to whether you believe in God or not, which fundamentally itself is not even a rational thing. It's based on fitrah, which is the natural position. Some people want to accept it, some people don't want to accept it.
Okay, well, you don't need to kind of make that assumption at the beginning of whether there is a God, there isn't a God. You can remain agnostic on that front.
No, but that's according to your worldview. According to my worldview, for example, myself, I was never an atheist.
Okay.
I doubted Islam many times when I was at university, but I never could imagine there is no God. So that may be your position, but you can't import that position onto me.
Okay.
My first principle was there's always a God. Okay. Even if I wasn't Muslim, I still believe in God.
Okay. Did you know what a God was when you were in your mother's womb?
No.
Okay. Do you know what a God was 1 second after you exited your mother's womb?
No.
Okay. So were you always a Muslim?
Well, we believe we were always in a state of fitrah, natural state. Muslim is different. So if somebody believes there's one creator who's worthy of worship, they're in a natural state, but they're not a Muslim.
Okay.
Right? So all children are in a fitrah state. Now, I never came to a point where okay, now I start to believe in God. For me, the belief in God was just truth. So the fact is this, your first principle, you have to acknowledge it's the first principle. Don't take your first principle and try and say that's the tabula rasa, that's the status quo. Because you have a first principle which is different to mine.
But how do you, I mean, how do you justify kind of believing that you had fitra? I mean, so what does fitra mean? When you first come out of the womb, you have no idea what God is. And then at some point you find out what God is. You must at some point start believing in God. And whereas, like, 1 second after you exit the womb, you aren't believing in God at that point.
So we believe deep down in all human beings, when human beings are in trouble or when human beings have a type of experience, a spiritual experience, the belief in God is directly in the heart and it just becomes uncovered. It doesn't enter the heart, it just becomes uncovered. So the fact of the matter is this: when somebody starts off with, I'm not sure if there's a God, they're not starting on some equal platform, they're starting on an agnostic first principle. But when someone like myself, when I'm starting with the first principle of the fitrah, it's not an argument for God, it's just a position from which you spring. Now, all of the arguments for God's existence or the Quran, they only are there to remind you of what you already know is true. They're not there to actually give you an abstract argument for God's existence or abstract argument for the Quran. Likewise, for an atheist who doesn't want to believe in God, his first principle is there is no God. No amount of argumentation is gonna, or proof is gonna convince him if he doesn't want to believe.
Shouldn't people try and make as few assumptions about, or as few kind of unjustified assumptions in their worldview as possible?
No, but it's not an assumption. It's a position you begin with. An assumption is different. So, for example, I'm going to make the assumption that, I don't know, the Earth is a certain circumference, and I'm going to try and test against that. First principles are different. For example, morals come from first principles. Either you believe in objective morality or you don't. There's nothing in the world, there's no philosophical argument or there's no scientific data that can convince you to go from morals are objective to subjective. There's none. No, you either begin with they exist or they don't.
But you could not adopt a position on that. You could say, I'm not sure whether...
Which is a position. Which is a position.
Isn't it a less closed position than saying
but that's
objective?
No, but that's
I'm not sure whether...
No, but that's an assumption because a solipsist who denies all reality, he can say, my first principle is there is no reality. I can turn around and say, I'm not a solipsist. My first principle is there is reality. He's going to say, look at me, I'm more cool, like I'm being more unsure. Well, I'm going to say you're being an idiot, right? So first principles is not a thing you argue from. It's actually, sorry, not a place you argue towards, something you argue from.
Okay, but like the example of a solipsist or thinking that there isn't a reality, you can that's something that's more easy to sort of show as a ridiculous.
No, you can't. You can never disprove a solipsist ever.
Well,
you know that.
No, but so there's I think therefore I am. So you know personally that you exist because at least you're experiencing something. So there must be at least some apparatus with which you're experiencing.
Yeah. What does a hard solipsist say?
What?
A hard solipsist would say, I'm the only thing.
Okay, but
which is kind of like, I think, therefore I am, so only I exist.
But isn't that sort of solipsist making an assumption as well?
Of course he is. That's the point.
Okay, so but then it sounded like you were using the example of a solipsist in order to kind of make it seem as though being agnostic or making less assumptions is the same thing or as.
I am, because what I'm saying is they're both positions.
But isn't one of the position making an assumption and the other position not making an assumption?
They both are.
Okay, well, so one is assuming
the solipsist is saying, I don't know if
reality apart from
or that's hard solipsism, or it could be like a type of soft solipsist and say, maybe the world is not real, maybe nothing exists, right? So either way, what I'm trying to say is this. He has a first principle, and the agnostic is not some cool guy who's balanced and who's just on the right tip, right? He is also making an assumption.
Okay, but
so it's starting from a first principle.
Okay, well, surely we can show sort of that this explanation is slightly wanting though, because we can consider a slightly different example, which might be if someone says there are two mountains over 2 kilometers high, of within 500 meters of each other in North Korea, kind of, unless you have like sort of some geographical background knowledge to that, kind of one person would be assuming more if they say yes, that's true. Another person would also be making an assumption if they say no, that's false.
Yeah, but these are
the person is like making the least assumptions, and it's like probably I'd say in the most kind of rational perspective.
That's
to say like I have no evidence for or against.
Yeah, sure,
this,
but James,
so
that's
I can't adopt a position on whether it's true or not.
Sure, James, that's a disanalogy because that's a physical assumption. First principles are metaphysical first principles. They're different. We're not talking about someone saying, I'm assuming that on the other side of that tree, all the leaves are purple. We're not talking about some physical, we're talking about metaphysical things. Because look, God, objective morals, reality, these are metaphysical things.
Okay. What's the
Sorry?
Why subjective morals? Metaphysics.
I don't understand what you're saying.
What you said, you're talking about values. Values,
Yeah, that's
moral values. Metaphysics, not physical world.
Yeah.
Why values?
Because from a purely physical perspective, morals don't exist. It's like color perception. Is that tree actually green? No, it's not. Green's what bounces back. So morals are what we export onto the world. We don't extract them from the world. For people who believe in subjective morality. I'm gonna go off to James. I'm gonna go off to pray.
Okay, yeah.
Good to speak to you.
يا هلا ويا هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا